question already to start? Fantastic. Go ahead.
I'll keep it less racy than the last one. I have a question about the audience engagement research. Did you find that audience engagement folks felt pressure from the business side to sort of explain their value? And how did that sort of conversation go?
They didn't express it as pressure. It sort of, again, it depended on the size of the outfit and how much weight they put on audience engagement. But there were clearly some that had more meetings with the marketing side and did have to explain certain things. But most of them were saying that it was a topic, but there was not really pressure. But it was just clear that that was an expectation, that that's why they were doing it. Because if people read your product, then money comes in.
I've got a question for Marcus. So you were mentioning tips and advice on how news organizations should just jump into doing the podcasting. Mm-hmm. And so one of my questions is to you, and maybe someone might feel this way in the crowd, is perhaps the reporters, journalists might want to do this, but management might be preventing them from doing so. So how do you work around that potential issue as well? If from a top-down approach, it may not be as welcomed if they're interested in doing it nonetheless. So how do you address that?
Well, I would say, most executives and most top folks I know are pretty profit-driven. And so I would just show them the money, show them all the articles and all the arguments saying, hey, this is actually really profitable. And there are a ton of resources and books and podcasts out there for launching a podcast and getting your voice out there. So from a market perspective, it actually makes a ton of sense, I think. And you can make that argument, I think, with most editors and most publishers. And I think that would probably get you quite a ways. But I would also say, no media, no publication is immune from this, the lack of faith that people have in mainstream media. That's pretty much across the board. And you can pitch and say, hey, this is one easy way that we can help our readers, help our listeners, our viewers get to know us personally. And the truth is, if they know you personally or feel like they do, then they're going to have a much higher appreciation and affection and opinion of your product, and that's part, I didn't get it, it's more in the paper than in the presentation, but part of it relates to media format, because, that expression that talk is cheap, well, no, talk is actually great, because by listening to people's voices and hearing their tonation and everything, you get to know them far better than you realize. It's a kind of a mind trick. It's tripping different circuits in your brain. So I would, make the profit argument, and I would also make the, hey, people want to get to know us, and this is an easy way to do that.
Looks like we have a question.
Following up on the podcast, I was just wondering when you were talking about, you had the 6 local podcasts, or the local newsrooms, the journalism podcasts that you were looking at. What was the most popular one? What were the topics? Did there seem to be anything related to the area they were focused on rather than the way they delivered it?
Well, so I tried to be fairly diverse about it. So the 538 Elections podcast was on there. The Voice of San Diego podcast was on there. Recode Decode was on there. So I tried to subject-wise, I tried to spread it out quite a bit. Typically, subject-wise, I found they stuck to those traditional journalism tropes. It's what is current, what is new in, high tech or news or San Diego, whatever it happens to be. And then what has conflict and what has notoriety. It felt like whatever they set out to say, this is our podcast, this is our niche, for the most part, they stuck to it, And there wasn't necessarily, everybody talked about the election the closer you got to November because, it was on everybody's mind. But it was still the election and whatever the topic happens to be, whatever the audience happens to be. So.
Question for Karen. So in terms of your research and what you've been doing, do you believe that there is a shift that is yet to happen in the newsroom in terms of the culture of looking at audience engagement, editors, and if you could talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that the shift has already happened in that every newsroom, I believe, I don't have empirical evidence, but I think most newsrooms have someone who's on a social team or audience engagement team. But I do think that a lot of journalists are still struggling to be on board. And one person I talked to said, this solution, the problem will fix itself through attrition. That the people who don't, it's an aging population, and if you're not on board and don't want to brand yourself, then, your time will come sooner rather than later. And I did find that a lot of the people who were doing this job, they all talked a little bit about how it had come about through the restructuring of the newsroom itself. A lot of them had been copy editors. There were no longer copy editors, so they got the job of audience engagement. Some of them were longtime members of the editorial board who had always said we need to be closer to our audience, so they took the lead in this. And so now I think the third wave sort of is not the people who were coerced into doing it and not the people who said, I'm leading the way, but people are hired to do it with intention. So I think the fact that they're working in the newsroom, that's something that's established. Whether or not journalists are all really on board and really believe that the ultimate goal, which is supposedly that they'll be their own audience engagement editors eventually, I think that's still something that's very much in the works.
Mm-hmm. And this might be a question for both Cindy and Karen. I mean, how do you see, in terms of product management as well as audience engagement, coming down to aspects of culture? We talk a lot about this all the time in journalism scholarship, but how much do you think we are at a point now where there may be a cultural shift happening in the newsrooms, or are we getting close to moving in that direction, or what more needs to happen in order for those things to be embraced?
I mean, I think in the case of my research, the fact that so many of them had "it depends" on this, and there were a lot of variables associated with it, it sort of demonstrates that these are not necessarily techniques that are mature yet, and that there's a lot of experimentation in the environment. And that's good. That, I think that signifies that there's some understanding that this is important, the fact that a lot of different organizations are trying it. But I think we still have a ways to go to get a broader understanding that journalism isn't just for what we've traditionally defined as journalists, and that there are a lot of people in the organization that contribute to the journalistic product, whether it's the audience engagement people, the product development people who maybe more traditionally were considered technology support and resources. They all have to be more central to the processes. And so, I mean, that was sort of the outcome I had of this, but in general, I think that's where the culture is going toward at this point. It's not there yet.
But isn't that part of most J schools' curriculum already? I know that at Merrill we have now someone teaching audience engagement. So if you're growing up to be a journalism in the framework of a journalism school, that's part of what you learn, just as much as you learn multimedia and all the other things, data journalism, it's all part of what we all expect upcoming journalists to have in their toolbox.
That's good.
So,
Which may be coming in the future within the next 3-5 years when they're entering into these newsrooms and graduating.
Actually, I think it's already something that's expected in the newsroom. Some of the people that I talked to, they said, either I have somebody who knows how to tell a story but doesn't know anything about social media, or somebody who knows social media but doesn't know how to tell a story. So I think you're right, the next generation, but I think the expectation is there that you can do both. Well,
and I think it goes beyond the skill set, right? I think both what you are addressing as well as what you're addressing too, John, is a mindset. It's going beyond just the functions of how, but really looking at a mindset of approaching different aspects of journalism in particular. And I thought perhaps you could also jump in a little bit and talk about that more, John, too, from the work that you and Mark were doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to try to connect it with some of the other panelists. I guess, analytics is a really interesting case because a lot of the analytics packages that are available, whether it's Google or NewsWhip or others, they're generating insights according to their own algorithms and their own ways of doing data collection and presenting data. And, to really interrogate, sort of how we're seeing what's important, there has to be some basic, I think, understanding of statistics and having a basic sort of numeracy. And so I think actually the skills that Mark and I were talking about are pretty integral to a lot of what you guys were talking about in terms of engagement and product management too. So there's sort of a food chain, and I guess what we'd argue is that I neglected to mention this, but IRE and NICAR have been so huge in our field in terms of trying to advance this. So I just hope that. It's hard, actually, to build a journalism education curriculum around analytics. We were talking about that last night because there aren't great tools. But. Yeah. So I try.
We have a question, and then we'll wrap it up.
About analytics and audience engagement. So what are the kind of topics that people whom you interviewed kind of discussed about people who are seeking to derail or divert the conversation, like more commonly known as like trolls?
What do you mean?
Like what were the techniques that they were using to kind of keep the audience engagement on track?
You mean to make sure that, for example, comment sections were not,
Correct.
yeah. You know, that's interesting because almost all of them said, I hate the comment section. We closed our comment section down. That's why we like doing this on Facebook or other platforms. And they're only starting, I mean, you know, the Coral Project out of DC, everybody's looking for a way to make sure that they can sort of control their comment sections a little bit better. So they were all sort of happy that it was happening on Facebook and it was more out of their hands than on their own site.
Okay, let's give a round of applause to our research panel.